All right, today we're going to look at three of Milton's, rather Wordsworth's sonnets that relate to our study in the Romantic epic. They are obviously, because they're sonnets, nothing like epics, but they do bear on one of the secondary themes of the course on the Romantic epic, namely the relation of these Romantic poets to Mr. John Milton. And we'll see in the 1802 sonnets that Milton is explicitly referenced by Wordsworth, and for rather different reasons than we have seen up to this point. And yet, nonetheless, I wanted to draw your attention to those references rather, because they mark something of a secondary aspect to Milton's influence, namely as a great patriot, and a patriot who nonetheless resisted tyranny and did so in opposition to a sort of how will I put this, a Catholic totalitarianism. And you'll see why I say that in a second, but it's primarily, to put it briefly, because of the influence of Napoleon Bonaparte on the continent. Now, if you recall what we said at the outset of the course, the great backdrop for the whole Romantic literary movement is the French Revolution, which took place in 1789 and commonly marked by the storming of the Bastille, the great prison in Paris where French political prisoners were housed, and which was stormed by the people, and in which convicts were freed, and eventually led to the execution of the monarch of the day. And as we said last time when we looked at Wordsworth's Prelude, he had left England's shores shortly thereafter, leaving his time at Cambridge to go to the continent, and had gone through France on a pilgrimage to Mont Blanc, and he cataloged that period in his work, The Prelude. But he also, and I didn't spend too much time on this, he also spoke of the malign influence of that period of French thinking that marked his thought. And he said that it marked a sort of a benighted period in his life. And not just in terms of politics, but even he associated it not just with a type of politics, which as an older man he was trying to distance himself from, but also with a very pattern of thinking. And this is what these sonnets seem to be alluding to. I want to look at three sonnets in particular. We'll look at London 1802. We will look at Great Men Have Been Among Us, Hands That Penned, which is just the first line of the poem. And then finally, It Is Not to Be Thought of that the flood, and again, this is just the first line of the sonnet sequence. So only the first one actually has a title. The others are just using the first line of the poem as the sonnet's title. But all three of these sonnets, it seemed to me, put Milton in a rather different light than we've seen up to this point in Wordsworth's literary corpus. As I said, as a great English patriot, and a patriot as ever of freedom, and of British freedom at that, but a British freedom that contradistinguishes itself from that which is to be found in particular on the continent, and especially in France. And this is a new development. As I say, you can see adumbrations of it in his work on the Prelude, which, as I say, was penned in 1805. And so you can see it influenced in the germination of his thought that led to the Prelude being here in these sonnet sequences, and the transformation in Wordsworth's own mind about the role of France and the events of the French Revolution. There's a decided shift here, and it is really to some degree encapsulated in these three sonnets, these three great sonnets. And I want to say more about that, but I do actually think I need to say something about Napoleon and the French political scene to give you a sense of the backdrop and what's going on here. In terms of the timeline of events in France, it needs to be noticed that in France, not only has the revolution taken place, but more significant events have transpired. So in late 1793, the revolutionaries have decided that it's insufficient that the ancien regime, the old political regime, has been disestablished. They want to move to a far more radical conception of what a revolution will entail, and it's largely atheistic in its intentions. And there was the prominent atheistic activist, very anti-clerical, because part of the French Revolution is this anti-clerical movement. So it's not just anti-monarchical, but anti-clerical. Now, this is not like the English Civil War. It wasn't anti-clerical per se. It was anti-papist. And it was in favor of the purification of Christian religion, whereas the French Revolution, as I said at the outset of the course, was not. It was more specifically anti-clerical, and not in favor of the purification of Christianity, as Cromwell's Republican government purported to be. And so this atheist activist, Sylvain Maréchal, published an almanac of honest people in 1788, and he spoke of a way of contemplating time itself, and in terms of a new earthly cycle. And so there was a calendar created, and it was implemented, and it was in accordance with the Age of Reason. And so all religious and royalist influences were to be expunged from the calendar, and the attempt was made to introduce the decimal system into the very chronology of the year and so forth. So that everything was divided in 10. So each day was divided into 10 hours. Well, how is that going to be? Well, an hour is going to be a lot longer than it is. So what we have currently is 24 hours will be extended or reduced to 10 hours. And those 10 hours will be divided furthermore into 10 decimal minutes, and each decimal minute into 100 decimal seconds. So an hour that was made into 144 conventional minutes, so twice as long. A minute is 86.4 seconds, and a second is 0.864 conventional seconds. So there's all sorts of rejigging of time. And clocks were made to consider this, and to, as I say, to bring in a rational approach to the understanding of time itself. Now, all of this, as I say, is anti-clerical, but it's also decidedly anti-Christian, because what it is doing is effectively getting rid of the idea of the Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, which had marked the previous calendars, whether you see it as Gregorian or otherwise, which had reigned for thousands of years. So there's a decided, not only anti-political animus here, but a decidedly anti-Christian animus, and it extends so far as to seek to rejig time itself. Now, Napoleon at this point in 1802 is the undisputed leader in France, and had by this point conquered the nations of Europe, with one exception, and that was Great Britain. And on the 2nd of August, 1802, he was proclaimed to be first consul for life by the Senate of France. And a few days later, the constitution of year 8 in the French Revolutionary calendar was overhauled by a Senate consult. Eventually, Napoleon, by the way, had to abolish the revolutionary calendar because it just simply didn't work, and wasn't so rational after all. But at this point, I want to bring to you to understand that a wholly radical attempt is there to basically start everything according to a rationalistic understanding of the way the world works. And so there's a goddess of reason that is installed in the French capital as well. And Napoleon, as I say, is proclaimed first consul for life. Well, 2 years later, this movement towards Napoleon's absolute power is completed when he becomes crowned the Emperor of France, December 2nd, 1804. So this is year 13 in the French Republican calendar. He's crowned at Notre Dame in Paris, and thus he brings about a sort of work of act of political theater, but it is baptized, as it were, as being legitimate by the Pope of the day. And so he wants to establish a new dynasty and a new nobility. And so to that end, he establishes this coronation ceremony in which he and his wife, Josephine, are crowned as the new emperor and empress of this French empire. So that's only 2 years down the road. And by this point, though, it is obvious to anyone who's living in Britain that the French regime, which began with an attempt to liberate the people from oppression, from political oppression, has now reconstituted itself in a much more radical form, with what are clearly, while religious in symbolism, are clearly anti-human in their action, and to some degree they're blasphemous, because Napoleon is brought in with the coronation hymn Veni Creator Spiritus, which is sung, Lord, send forth your spirit, and they respond, and renew the face of the earth. And then there's a collect for the feast of Pentecost. So the Holy Spirit is instantiated in the person of the Roman emperor. And then he goes out and, of course, is bringing about a renewal of God's Spirit on earth. And of course, this comes with the imprimatur of the Pope of the day. So all of this, 2 years on from Wordsworth's poem, is nonetheless seen by Wordsworth. And in that light, we have to read these 3 poems. So with having said that, I hope that gives a very brief but important backdrop and in our understanding of what he is saying when he is invoking Milton in these 3 poems. Because, of course, Milton himself had opposed the monarch of his day, Charles I, along with the Republicans, and because they saw him also as a type of tyrant who suspended civil liberties, who suspended Parliament almost indefinitely, who was imposing a sort of religious, to their mind, blasphemous religion upon the British people, etc. And again, Milton and his compatriots had opposed that, and now Wordsworth is seeing himself as invoking that spirit to some degree, and he's changed his views. So let me look at London 1802. I'm going to read all 3 of the sonnets because they're sufficiently brief that I can do that. And what I want to say at the outset in terms of these 3 sonnets is that Wordsworth is experimenting with the sonnet form here in a way that I think is rarely recognized, but demonstrates his poetic genius, quite frankly. Historically speaking, there tend to be 3 or 2 basic types of sonnets. The one that was initiated by Edmund Spenser, the great Puritan poet, in which we have 3 quatrains and a rhyming couplet at the end. That tended to be the form that Shakespeare followed. And on the other hand, the Petrarchan sonnet, which predates it, it's an Italian Renaissance form, that has an octave and a sestet. And the octave and the sestet are more or less the form that Wordsworth follows here, but what he does not follow is the lineation, the rhyme scheme, or the lineation that Petrarch does. And we'll see that in the 3 sonnets, Wordsworth is fairly consistent in the octave. That is the rhyme scheme of the first 8 lines. But in the sestet, he is varying quite experimenting quite widely with the form. And nonetheless, I think he produces three great poems, which to some degree are similar in their emphasis. But let me read the first one, London 1802, and it will be evident very quickly what Wordsworth is saying about Mr. Milton, because he invokes him in the very first word. Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour. England hath need of thee. She is a fen of stagnant waters. Altar, sword, and pen, fireside, the heroic wealth of hall and bower, have forfeited their ancient English dower of inward happiness. We are selfish men. Oh, raise us up, return to us again, and give us manners, virtue, freedom, power. Thy soul was like a star and dwelt apart. Thou hadst a voice whose sound was like the sea, pure as the naked heavens, majestic, free. So didst thou travel on life's common way in cheerful godliness, and yet thy heart the lowliest duties on herself did lay. So it's quite clear what the poem is dedicated to. As I say, the title of the poem is London 1802. That more or less probably marks the venue in which he has written the poem. But the poem is dedicated to Milton, as is abundantly clear. And the reason that he is invoked is precisely because England in Wordsworth's day, it has become stagnant and is in need of the heroic mold of individual that he casts Milton to represent, not just in his poetry then, but in his love of inward happiness, the paradise within happier far, with which the angel Gabriel consoles Adam and Eve as they leave the earthly paradise and being cast out into the wilderness, away from the paradise that they had been up to that point in their lives enjoying, but they are consoled with the idea that they shall have a paradise within them, happier far. Now, this paradise within them, which Wordsworth avers to here in line 6, the inward happiness, he says that this is the English dowry, the English dower of inward happiness, this sense of conscience and the recognition of conscience, even in the midst of dispute, the recognition that the freedom of the conscience is an English birthright that Wordsworth now associates most strongly with Mr. Milton as defending. Now, he's probably has in mind his Areopagitica, which, if you look at one of my YouTube lectures, was the first defense of free speech written in the English language, and probably its most famous. And he wrote that in the midst of an English parliament, actually, interestingly, under the Republican government, in which they tried to censor speech and censor religious views that did not accord with the dominant Puritan mold of thinking. Now, this is fascinating. Milton the Puritan speaking against his fellow Puritans in their desire to have religious conformity on the matter of Puritan doctrine. Milton says, how different is that than what the Presbyterians wanted to do in Scotland and what the Catholics wanted to do, the Anglo-Catholic Charles I, in bringing in the Book of Common Prayer and opposing that and the forms of religious worship. Milton won't have it in either way. And so Milton was always a bit of an iconoclast, and Wordsworth sees that sort of freedom of conscience as the thing that is really at stake in the war with Napoleon, or the believed to be imminent war with Napoleon, because at this point Napoleon is gathering his troops and trying to find a way of breaching the British shores. He has to cross the English Channel. To do that, he needs a navy sufficient to bring him across. He doesn't have one. Likewise, the British are faced with a similar problem, but it's in reverse. They have the navy to keep the French off of their shores, but they don't have the army on the continent to be able to defeat Napoleon. And we'll have to wait 10 years for that to happen when Napoleon meets his Waterloo in 1812. And there is a sort of a liberation of the continent from, again, the vassalage which Napoleon brought under the banner of liberation in the Napoleonic Empire. Now, I find this really interesting when you see the discussions of these, you know, whether it's Star Wars or similar such appeals to the idea of the Republic and then the Empire, one immediately thinks of Rome and the switch under Augustus Caesar from the Republican period to an imperial period, and rightly so. But what is often neglected is a far better correspondence to that transition takes place in the French Republic and under the French Empire in the person of Napoleon, particularly with its anti-Christian and anti-religious animus, which we don't see in Caesar Augustus. What we see in Caesar Augustus is an overlap actually with the life of Jesus Christ, because it happens right in and around the same time when Christ is walking the floor of this earth. But he says Wordsworth's explanation for why the three things are actually the five things that we are marked by stagnancy in lines 3 and 4. Of altar, oh, stagnancy, he's making a religious criticism, of sword, of the nobility, and pen, of the intellectual caste, the clerics, people like himself. The fireside being the common home and the pubs, and the heroic wealth of hall and bower. All of these, he says, have forfeited this ancient birthright. And for those of us who are living under COVID, we can probably recognize Wordsworth's lament in our own day. It seems like the English birthright of freedom has been renounced by those who are its greatest beneficiary. And what is Wordsworth's explanation? Line 6, we are selfish men. And so in response to that, he implores something. Is he invoking Milton to do something here? I presume not, but it's not abundantly clear to what he is appealing. Is he calling upon God to do this? If it were Milton himself, he would call upon God. It's merely a sort of lament whose object is not abundantly clear here. But anyway, with that said, he said, "Oh, raise us up, return to us again." What should be returned to? I guess this love of freedom, this inward freedom, and give us manners, virtue, freedom, power. It does seem like an invocation of Milton, the spirit of Milton. I don't think Milton, were he to hear this prayer, would respond to Mr. Wordsworth. Nonetheless, thy soul was like a star and dwelt apart. Thou hadst a voice whose sound was like the sea. Pure as the naked heavens, majestic, free, so didst thou travel on life's common way in cheerful godliness. And yet thy heart the lowliest duties on herself did lay. Now, I mentioned the form of the sonnet. I'm not going to dwell on it too much here. But if you went through the rhyme scheme here, the poem in the octaves goes A, B, B, A, B, B, A, hour, fen, pen, bower, dower, men, again, power. And then, as I say, it varies quite widely here. And there's one line that stands out, and I'll come to that in a second. Apart, see, free, way, heart, lay. C, D, D, E, F, E. What line stands out in particular? Well, the F stands out, the penultimate line. It concludes with this word heart. And the word heart, whether we're aware of the rhyme scheme or not, jumps out because it breaks with the lineation, however heterodox it becomes at this point. This line in particular, and the emphasis on this line, gets strong attention precisely because of that emphasis. Furthermore, the line in jams in the penultimate line going into the next line. And yet thy heart the lowliest duties on herself did lay. So Wordsworth associates Milton's heart and his voice and his spirit with a inward freedom, the character of which he does not identify at all. And it certainly does not seem to be associated with his Christianity in any way explicitly. And this, of course, reflects the Milton that Wordsworth identifies rather than the Milton as he himself would recognize it. But at any rate, it's a magnificent poem. And the lowliest duties on herself, which he did lay, what were these duties? Well, in Wordsworth's mind, probably his work in political office, setting aside his epic pretensions and epic vocation, and it's Wordsworth or Milton famously stated that he, from an early age, believed that he was to be England's great epic poet, and that God had laid that upon him, and yet for many decades he did not get to his task, largely because of the political events of the day, and he set that aside. And the lowliest duties on himself which he did lay, well, he wrote on behalf of the Republican government, trying to keep the royalist and Catholic powers of the day and the empire of his day, the Holy Roman Empire, from invading England's shores and destroying the, at that point, nascent republic. But I'll conclude with that that brief little look at London 1802. Let me move on to hit the second poem that I wanted to address, which is Great Men Have Been Among Us. Hands that pent. I'll read it first of all, and then we will make further comment, but we'll see it's in the same sort of spirit as the previous poem. Great men have been among us, hands that penned and tongues that uttered wisdom, better none. The later Sidney, Marvell, Harrington, young Vane, and others who called Milton friend. These moralists could act and comprehend. They knew how genuine glory was put on, taught us how rightfully a nation shone in splendor, what strength was, that would not bend but in magnanimous meekness. France, 'tis strange, hath brought forth no such souls as we had then. Perpetual emptiness, unceasing change, no single volume paramount, no code, no master spirit, no determined road, but equally a want of books and men. Now this anti-French screed, anti-French animus here in Wordsworth is quite extraordinary. And in all of the annals of the anti-French spirit, which we see at points in English writing, there's always been a rivalry of sorts between the French and the English. This is perhaps one of the most emphatic in its denunciation of the French, because it says that they've literally produced no men or books worthy of the English, their English compeers. I think we would have found that not that long before this, the English would have rather emphatically disagreed with this, namely in the early 18th century. Under Pope and Swift and Dryden, we could certainly see a rather different assessment of the French and their books and their men, for that matter. Nonetheless, under Wordsworth here, we see a sense, once again, of a different character, national character, now being sketched out by Wordsworth from that which the French themselves produce. And there is no particular reason associated with that other than the one that he identifies in line 5, that these moralists could act and comprehend, and furthermore, at line 6, they knew how genuine glory was put on, and how taught us how rightfully a nation shone in splendor, what strength was that could not bend but in magnanimous meekness. There's the line. And in this, there's an enjambment between the octave and the sestet. So he moves across even into and breaks the sort of unstated divide between lines 8 and 9, and therefore draws our attention, if we have any sort of a sense of form, to the main emphasis of the poem is this idea of magnanimous meekness. Now, meekness in Wordsworth's rendering here does not have the sense of the biblical sense of what meekness is. Moses was said to be the meekest man who walked the earth at his time. Jesus says that blessed are those who are meek. Meekness in that rendering is a sort of an obedience to the will of God and a willingness to be used by God. Whereas in Wordsworth's rendering of a sort of a meekness and a magnanimous meekness, it seems more to be a character trait of a quietness and a connection with the status quo, and a lack of external, I don't want to say irritability, but even excitability, a sort of a calmness as a British legacy, which may or may not be true. It certainly becomes idealized in the Victorian period, you know, the stiff upper lip and all of that. But that's for a later time. Milton, or rather Wordsworth, is already expressing this as a British character trait, the sort of stoicism for which the British Empire itself was later renowned, and probably rightfully so as such. But Wordsworth now connects that historic Britishness with the new Britishness. I'm not sure that when we look at the later Sidney, Algernon Sidney, Andrew Marvell, James Harrington, and Sir Henry Vane, Puritan poets, that they would have connected their particular moral compass with a psychological profile, per se, or with Stoicism, which is what more or less we get in Wordsworth's rendering here. And I think Wordsworth is one that, to some degree, reduces the British Puritan spirit to something closer to a Stoic disposition. But note how this is this Stoicism, which he calls a magnanimous meekness, is juxtaposed with France, which is just pure emptiness, perpetual emptiness, he says. And the nature of the perpetual emptiness is mentioned in line 11. It's the unceasing change. It's the thing that Edmund Burke would once have excoriated. The change for the sake of change. It's the commitment to chaos without any real rational or moral underpinning. Now, the rational underpinning is appealed to in the sense that, again, as I said at the outset, the French Republican calendar is seeking to make time a decimal thing, in the same way that height in the metric system has been, or various other measures. But in terms of time, it has never been successful, and yet the French sought to do so here. And so he says there's no master, there's no code, there's no master spirit, no determined road. So there is a tabula rasa. Now, this is ironic coming from an Englishman once again, because of course the one who is most famous for the tabula rasa is John Locke, who is basically the most important English philosopher of the 18th century, even though he writes in the later 17th century. But at any rate, that's what the charge is here. And so we see the great animus against French commitment to radical revolution in Wordsworth's work. And he says there is equally a want of books and men. Again, as I say, quite an attack on the French spirit that Wordsworth pens here, and to be explained, if not excused, by reference to the political events of the day. That's the second poem I was looking at. Now I would like to look at the third one. That was a pretty brief look, but I wanted this not to be too long. The third one that I am going to look at is in line, no, it is not to be thought of that the flood, which is the first line of the poem. Let me read it first, and then we will make Commentary. It is not to be thought of that the flood of British freedom, which to the open sea of the world's praise from dark antiquity hath flowed, with pomp of waters unwithstood, roused though it be full often to a mood which spurns the check of salutary bands, that this most famous stream in bogs and sands should perish, and to evil and to good be lost forever. In our halls is hung armory of the invincible knights of old. We must be free or die, who speak the tongue that Shakespeare spake, the faith and morals hold which Milton held. In everything we are sprung of earth's first blood, have titles manifold. Again, a stirring poem, like the other two, I think. And in all three, a strong sense of a call to arms, not physical arms per se, against the physical threat that Napoleon brings, but more of the intellectual threat that the age of Napoleon has cast over even the British mind, and the lack of a desire for the freedom, which is, as he said in the first poem, the English dower. He thinks that it is literally impossible because of the origins and the very nature of the English themselves. Now, this sense of Britishness, which Wordsworth appeals to here, he connects with its early origins and early beginnings. So there's almost a mythologizing going on on Wordsworth's part here. And in his references to the sea and to the river, here we have echoes of the psalm, for the river to the ends of the earth, Psalm 72 verse 8, which I think is in the Canadian coat of arms, or one of the Canadian symbols here. But also I think we can see echoes of what we will later see in the Victorian period in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, a reference to Britain and the influence of the river and the River Thames, and how this is the river itself is almost a conduit for freedom, in which there's been an interaction between freedom and paganism and freedom and tyranny throughout the ages, the famous stream, which is a source of living water and life-giving freedom in the midst of bogs and sands, which Wordsworth sees as his contemporary age being mired in, and the bogs and the sands, which were earlier referred to as fens. This is the land around Cambridge, is the fen lands, by the way. There's a sense of stagnancy and a lack of vitality. And the threat of Napoleon is the threat of, again, the worldliness and a lack of commitment to freedom. And once again, this is the keynote of Wordsworth's poem here, is this idea of British freedom, which he sees as a flood that has ever triumphed over the stagnancy and the opposition of lesser waters. And in fact, he puts it so strongly as to say that we must be free or die, who speak the tongue that Shakespeare spake. The faith and morals hold which Milton held. Now that is very interesting. So the tongue is associated with Shakespeare, the faith and morals with Milton, rather than the reverse. Both spoke the English language. But note that here, Shakespeare, it's not the faith and morals of Shakespeare that he invokes, and the tongue which Milton spoke, both of which could be inverted because both of them spoke the same tongue. It's particularly his Protestantism in Milton's part, and his Puritanism furthermore, and his commitment to austerity and moral uprightness, which we do associate with Milton more than with Shakespeare, about whom we actually know very little in terms of his personal life and personal convictions. But he says of all of these things that they are sprung of earth's first blood and have titles manifold. So the birthright of English freedom, which goes back to Magna Carta, he doesn't refer to this, but he says that once again, this is the thing that is going to help the English people resist the tyranny of thought and manners and arms, which now threatens the entirety of the continent of Europe and England as well. So with that said, let me comment about the form a little bit. It's slightly different from the others insofar as there is the octave is broken up a little bit. So it goes ABBA, ACCA. So flood, sea, antiquity, withstood. ABBA. Mood, bands, sands, good. ACCA. Again, variation from the metrical form of the previous two sonnets that we looked at. And then he goes on to, in the sestet, something far more regular, the DE, DE, DE. Not a Spenserian sonnet, not a Petrarchan sonnet, his own sonnet. But he had noted that he is, as a poet, not only meditating on the themes of freedom, associated prominently with the person of Milton, but also with the form of poetry. And as I say, Wordsworth is a great poet here, and he's trying out different ways of expressing his ideas of freedom here. But what jumps out in the poem is that once again, he enjambs the line between 8 and 9. And so he says in line 8, and in bogs and sands should perish. And then there's a full stop, a caesura in the line, right in line 8. And then he moves on in the rest of the line to enjam it into the 9th line. So it spills over the line, and he says, and to evil and to good be lost forever. The consequence. The bounds of the verse have been breached, and likewise the bounds between good and evil have been breached. And so the sense is that unless England should withstand the might of Napoleon and his first consulship and his French army, then good and evil will themselves, the boundary between good and evil will be vanquished, and evil will triumph. But he says that this is impossible because of the very nature of the British people. In our halls is hung armory of the invincible knights of old. We must be free or die who speak the tongue that Shakespeare spake. The faith and morals hold that Milton held. In everything we are sprung of earth's first blood, have titles manifold. Stirring stuff. Whatever we make of the sentiment and its connection with the English people, there can be no doubt that the Anglosphere, those who have regarded the tongue that Shakespeare spake and the faith and morals held that Milton held, to be those that have led their speakers to greater liberty and greater happiness than any nation on earth. They have continued to inspire as they once did, and some of us believe that there are still power in those ancient words and in the blood of those ancient peoples, which has now been combined with the benefits of many nations. But at any rate, here it is once again, it is cast in the backdrop of the Napoleonic threat, and it is presented as something in particular connected with Milton. And that marks a significant difference in our understanding and appreciation of the Romantics in relation to Milton. And I wanted to just speak to that aspect of it and conclude this episode with that thought. Thank you.